Uh, Hi all. So we're here today discussing should wealth be redistributed, um, which was the topic of my dissertation some years ago, but is more
Hmm.
importantly the topic of a new debate book, part of the Routledge Little Debates About Big Questions series, which Tyron Goldschmidt and I are co-editing. Um, I've done previous videos with the authors of the books on God and on political authority. You can find those elsewhere on the channel. While you're at it, you can like this video, subscribe, donate to the Patreon, mail me snacks, whatever seems good to you. But I'm here with James Otteson and Steve McMullen, the co-authors of this book, people with different perspectives. Jim is a philosopher by training, but teaches at the College of Business at Notre Dame, where I did my PhD. Steve is an economist at Hope College. Works, I realized, on a lot of the same things that I've worked on, stuff having to do with animal ethics and religion, also economic inequality. So yeah, I'm hoping it will be a good conversation. We'll have each person give kind of an opening statement where they give an outline of the case that they make in the book, and then we'll move into open conversation and so forth. So, Steve, if you want to go first, you'll be presenting the case in favor of wealth redistribution. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. Thank you, Dustin. And of course, thank you, Jim, for being my co-laborer on this project over the last couple of years. It's been a joy. The project has been very interesting. I want to start by laying out some kind of parameters of the argument that I want to make, because wealth distribution is a really big topic. And in trying to make an argument in favor of wealth redistribution, I could mean something very big or something very little. And I try to aim for something that I think captures the spirit of where dialogue is politically and economically right now. And that is that in arguing for wealth redistribution, I'm arguing for an expansion of government programs in the United States that in general benefit those who are less well off than average, right? And I leave that very general because it doesn't have to mean a transfer of money, right? A redistribution of wealth, at least the way it's usually thought of in the literature, could also mean a transfer of benefits of some kind. It could be healthcare or education, but then of course it could be money. In my definition, or in my case, I'll make a case for expanded education, healthcare, food stamps, which are at least money-like, and then also some savings accounts. So some will be money and some would be government services. So you can think of the argument I want to make as kind of a moderate expansion of the welfare state from where it is in the United States today. Now, note that means I'm also making an argument about the United States. We could make an argument in general about wealth redistribution, but as an economist, I'm much more comfortable talking about specifics than I am specific policies than I am making a case in the abstract. And that's one of the, I think, interesting things about the conversation between Jim and I is that I lean as an economist into a particular part of the conversation, and he leans into a different part. And then we get to argue with each other in the text, and I think it results in a very nice interdisciplinary dialogue in addition to debate about the issues. So my case is that I want to expand the welfare state in the United States and do so in some kind of well-vetted ways. Now, to make that argument, if I were a philosopher, my understanding is the way that I would proceed is to start by laying out a description of an account of justice, then show that poverty or inequality violates this account of justice, and then justify some move. I try to move in that kind of direction, except I don't want to commit myself to a particular theory of justice, in part because that's not my strength. I'm not a philosopher. And I find the debates between philosophers to be really educational, really interesting. But to actually justify the redistribution of wealth, there are lots of frameworks we could choose from. So I could argue as a utilitarian that those who are relatively wealthy don't get as much benefit from their wealth as those who are poor would. That would be a common way to approach the argument. I could argue, as Rawls does, that there's a basic element of justice that means that we should give some priority to those who are least well off. That would be another way of approaching it. I could come at this as a socialist or a Marxist theorist and say the reason we should redistribute wealth is because the current pattern of wealth is the result of some grave injustice, right? As an economist, we tend to use slightly different language than these, but I do want to lay out for readers and for listeners here what I'm aiming for. And so I'm gonna offer an account of justice that I think is kind of minimal in this literature, at least. And that is, I think to achieve a just economic system, we want to ensure that each person has what is necessary to have the opportunity to participate in public life. So I want to argue for a kind of equality of opportunity, but in particular, what you might call a substantive opportunity. I think that current patterns of poverty and inequality limit people's ability to participate in public life in important ways. And I draw on Amartya Sen's capabilities work here to argue that there's just basic kinds of participation in society that are really important. And that as a matter of justice, we should do what we can, at least in wealthy societies, to try to provide those. Now, I could go in much more depth here in terms of the political philosophy. Suffice it to say, there's lots of different philosophers who disagree about what the goal is that we should be aiming for. And so I'm using this kind of in a descriptive sense. This is the goal that I think describes justice. And I make the argument that lots of different accounts of justice, even if they disagree, will probably all agree that pursuing this kind of equality of opportunity will at least fit with their account of justice, even if it isn't the ideal that they would aim for. And so that's basically the first big chunk of my argument, is that we should aim for this kind of equality of opportunity, which allows for participation in public life and in economic life. But then to make the argument from there, I think I need to show at least two things for folks to take my argument seriously. And the first is that economic opportunity in the United States today is actually limited by poverty and or inequality, such that redistribution at least has the potential of bringing us closer to a more just world. So I'm going to talk about my argument there for a little bit, but I'll just note that the last piece of the argument that I think is important is then to note that not only is poverty and inequality limiting opportunity and participation in the economy today, but it's also the case that we have a good reason to believe that the government has the capability of redistributing wealth in such a way that people would have the kind of opportunities that I think they should have. All right, so the result is we talk about philosophy in this debate, but we're also going to be thinking about the nature of poverty and inequality in the economy. So there's some descriptive work to do. And then there's also some public policy work to do, which is to say we need to know whether or not whether we have evidence that the government actually can do the things that I want it to do. And so my debate with Jim ranges kind of in all of these areas. We talk about moral philosophy, we talk about descriptions of economic life, and we also talk about the effectiveness of government action. So let me take those two pieces in turn, and then I'll try to address one more thing before I'm done here, and then I'll turn it over to Jim. So first, my argument that economic opportunity is limited today by poverty and inequality, and I also include here a section about the history of racial injustice in the United States, which I think also for a lot of folks is a really important motivator for government policy to bring about economic justice. But first, let's think about poverty. Poverty in the United States is a problem. It's not as big a problem as it is in some other parts of the world. And it is not as bad as it has been in the past, in some cases in the United States, but it has been a persistent problem, and one that has persisted to a surprising degree throughout the 20th century. And I think of poverty as limiting economic opportunity in about four different ways. Broadly speaking, poverty limits opportunity because in the United States, we sort geographically to such a large degree into areas either that have a lot of economic opportunity or have relatively few. And that sorting depends a lot on your economic resources. So in the town that I lived in Grand Rapids for a while, I lived very close to the line for a really good school district. I happened to live just on the side of the line in a less good school district. And here, good meaning my kids weren't actually in the schools, but in terms of the test scores and the performance and the number of students that went on to college and graduated. And the difference between housing values between those two school districts was really dramatic, as it is in many cities in the United States. So that you had to be fairly wealthy to live in the area where you could go to the relatively better school. Now, there's a lot of laws that we've passed that have made that better, but geography matters a lot for opportunity. We have good evidence of that. Built into that is education. People with a certain amount of baseline material resources have a lot better access to education and training, the ability to travel for jobs. But we also see just basic health and nutrition having a really big difference. So we see families below the poverty line have really noticeable and measurable health and nutrition deficits that are markedly improved when they get access to government support in the form of food or healthcare. These health consequences follow kids throughout their entire lives. And we see real stress. The stress of poverty makes it very difficult for families trying, if they don't have stable housing, to plan long-term financial strategies and these kinds of things. The overall picture here is that poverty limits the kind of long-term opportunities that we'd want, particularly young people, to have. Now, inequality is more of an abstract argument. The level of inequality in the United States, though, also limits economic opportunity, partly because the more unequal the society, the more incentive there is and opportunity is for us to sort into more starkly divided neighborhoods and schools and states and industries, and also into different social groups. The result being that social capital and other things that give young people opportunities certainly exists throughout the income distribution, but there's a noticeable difference between the economic opportunities of those at the top and those at the bottom. So this adds up to a picture where poverty and inequality makes a big difference for the opportunities young people have in society. And the result is that some significant amount of our people's long-term trajectory, on average, not always, but on average, has something to do with the background that they come from. And a lot of that is not up to the young people at all. Some of it's not up to the choices of parents, but simply the fact that their parents have had bad luck in a career or health problems that have prevented them from having the resources that those children might otherwise have. Now, I'll put here also that I talk in the book about historic racial injustice, and I focus in particular on injustice to Black Americans and Native Americans in the U.S. And just note that there still exists in the U.S. some real kind of formal limits to opportunity in the form of discrimination. Formal often means legal, but in the form of discrimination, which we have pretty good evidence of still existing in the United States, in labor markets and in financial markets. And then, of course, a long history that has kind of a long effect on wealth patterns. And I think these add to the case for some kinds of redistribution here in the economy today. Now, if you're with me on that, then I think I still need to demonstrate that the government can do what I want it to do. And here, I don't want to try to defend everything that any government has ever done, certainly. Anything the U.S. government has ever done, or anything the U.S. government has ever done as a part of the welfare state. That would be beyond my ability as a researcher. And also there's plenty of bad policies if you start digging through the history books. But I do think we can identify some core parts of the welfare state today that are working. We have good evidence that they're working, and they're worth expanding. And so the ones I identify are the food stamp program, popularly food stamps, but it's a supplemental nutrition assistance program, or SNAP benefits. Health insurance coverage, I'd talk about SCHIP, or the Children's Health Insurance Program, but also, of course, Medicaid. I point to preschool programs. And then the last program that I offer here is more speculative because we don't have a history for it, but it's the idea of creating opportunity accounts to create some sort of base level of wealth for students to invest in college education or put a down payment on a house. And we can talk about those if it matters. I'll just note, rather than talking about these policies in detail, I'll note that there is good evidence that these policies have a substantive long-term effect on people's ability to participate in important ways in public life. So Medicaid, we now have great evidence that the states that implemented Medicaid first and the populations that were first eligible for it had lifelong benefits in the form of lower mortality rates, better education, higher wages, better labor force participation, such that there's actually a significant decrease in their use of public benefits in the future once you look sort of over the whole life scale. We see similar kinds of long-term effects from access to food stamp programs because of the nutrition and health benefits, particularly for the kids who are in households who have access to the food stamp programs compared to those who don't. Women who grew up with access to food stamps have greater self-sufficiency, higher wages, and spend less time in public benefits over their life scale or over their lifespan as a result of having this program available when they're very young. So that strikes me as evidence both that the government has done something right with these programs, but also that the absence of these programs would have significantly limited these folks' ability to participate in the labor markets in the ways that they would want to, and we would want them to. Now, that's the case, that we can make a real difference. I should note, though, as an economist, I want to end the way I ended in the textbook, or in the book, which is to say, I need to address the fact that there is a really significant literature and concern among economists and philosophers and public policy scholars about the bad effects, both of programs and of the taxes that I would have to raise to pay for the programs. And here I would just note that there's good evidence of moral hazard problems, of disincentive effects where people work less because they have access to public benefits, and then also the effects of the taxes. And I just note that I think it's our responsibility to choose programs and to expand them in such a way that they limit these effects. So that's what I tried to do. I tried to expand programs in such a way that they didn't create what economists would call sort of big changes in the marginal tax rate or effective marginal tax rate, meaning that there isn't an incentive to stop working at some point because you'd lose all your benefits or something like that. And I think actually the policies that I propose would kind of smooth out the benefit structure to avoid those incentive problems and some of those moral hazard problems. And I tried to choose tax changes also that wouldn't have a really significant impact on negative incentives. No tax is costless, but I tried to choose the ones that I was the least worried about. And I give some evidence that would be the case. And that's what I think responsible public policy looks like in this area. We try to find the policies that work the best. We try to fund them in the most responsible ways. And we try to aim those policies where a vision of justice would say we're going to do the most good. And that's the case I try to lay out.
Right. So to briefly sum up, your kind of guiding value here is a certain conception of equality of opportunity. Philosophers talk about, there are different conceptions of equality of opportunity. Like one would just say, well, as long as there are no legal barriers to me doing such and such, I have equality of opportunity. You want a more substantive one that's only satisfied if I really have the resources and ability and practice to pursue the opportunity. You can see my cat is here behind me. You're thinking a variety of or one of my cats is here behind me. You're thinking a variety of different theories of justice among the different controversial theories. A variety of different theories of justice could maybe converge on thinking that this conception of equality of opportunity is important. You're thinking equality of opportunity in the US right now is hindered by poverty, economic inequality, sometimes racial injustice. And you think that in practice, we can see particular programs like SNAP or government provision of healthcare, these sorts of things, that help address these problems. And if they are well designed, can do so in a way that doesn't create other bad effects, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes, what you said. I agree with those things.
Very good. Very good. All right. Jim?
Thank you very much, Dustin and Steve. So thanks for the overview, Steve, of the argument. I think the first thing to say is that on many of the substantive points Steve makes, we're in agreement. So the idea about substantive equality of opportunity, or some version of equality of opportunity, being part of any morally justifiable system of political economy or system of politics and economics. I think I agree with that, and I think most people would agree with that. The real question is, what's the best way to achieve it? And I'll say I'll also sort of start at a bit of a higher level, maybe leaning into my philosophical training, if you like, Steve, based on going off what you said. The book is called "Should Wealth Be Redistributed?" A debate. In my case, less so, I think, in Steve's case, but in my case, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. So I apologize about that, Dustin. So my argument is not that wealth. So I don't claim to show that wealth should not be redistributed. But what I do claim is that certain attempts at or certain visions of how we should redistribute wealth, the arguments for them don't support the conclusion. I'm also a little bit, I want to specify the kind of wealth redistribution we have in mind. And this really gets to my first sort of philosophical point, I guess. Wealth is already distributed in many ways. In any kind of an economy, wealth gets distributed. And in fact, it gets redistributed as well through things like charity, for example. So, the topic of our discussion and the debate that Steve and I have in this book specifically homes in on not just general distribution of wealth or where wealth should be or where it shouldn't be, but rather specifically having government programs redistribute wealth. And that I emphasize that because I think that raises the philosophical stakes a bit. Because when you're talking about government wealth redistribution, part of what that means is that you're endorsing policies that will take some people's wealth and put it in places that they themselves don't want it to go. And if they already wanted it to go, you might expect, well, then they're already going to engage in charity or distribute their wealth in whatever other ways they might by buying and selling or partnering or whatever. But we're specifically entertaining the case of, no, we're going to take people from money from some people who don't want to give it up and put it in places where they aren't already wanting it to go. So my suggestion, my sort of philosophical argument, which is kind of the baseline of much of the argument I make throughout my contributions to this, is that raises the justificatory burden. It doesn't mean we can't do it, but it means we need a special justification for that because we're dealing with people who I define in the book. I call sort of my fundamental moral principles, a principle of equal moral agency, where all human beings are equal moral agents. And one of the implications, I think, of that is that unless there's some pretty good reason otherwise, we should respect people's preferences and choices. So there are plenty of cases in which we override people's preferences and choices, and I think justifiably do so. If they're engaging in criminal activity or if they're maybe imminently about to engage in criminal activity, those are paradigm cases, but there are others as well. But nevertheless, I think it does raise the philosophical stakes, as it were. You have to really make a compelling argument that wealth redistribution, that mandatory or government wealth redistribution is a case that meets this higher justificatory burden. And I think many arguments for government wealth redistribution don't make that case or don't rise to that level. And part of it is, and this I think is a way of reflecting some of Steve's argument, that if we're going to talk about any kind of policy, but we'll stick with any kind of government policy, we'll stick with wealth redistribution. The first question I think you have to ask is, well, is what we're considering doing consistent with morality, sort of generally speaking? So Steve says, you could be a utilitarian, you might be a Rawlsian, right? There are different conceptions of what it would mean to be moral. But the first question is it consistent with morality? Perhaps also in some cases, is it required by morality? But if the answer is yes, that it's either consistent with or perhaps required by morality, then what we're usually talking about at that point is the goal. In other words, what is the thing we're trying to accomplish with the policy, not the policy itself? And if we're thinking about the goal, then the next question, which is part of what Steve addressed, and that is whatever policy we're proposing predictably or reasonably effective? In other words, do we have good reason to think it will actually achieve the goal? And Steve suggested some evidence about at least some of the policies that he was interested in. I will just sort of register as a footnote, and maybe we can come back to this later, Dustin, that I'm not so sure all of the evidence is quite as dispositive as Steve suggests. So the second question then would be, is it predictably effective? But then I think there's a further question, and this really does get to something that's a bit more of a challenge for arguments like Steve's, I think. and that is what I call the good is good enough fallacy. And what I mean by that is that the fact that we can accomplish some good, even a good, good result, even a good result that we all agree is a good result, doesn't by itself settle the case. And that's both sort of morally or on principle, as it were, and then also economically. So the moral issue is, well, merely saying we can accomplish some good doesn't yet say whether what we're proposing to do to accomplish it is actually consistent with, say, the proper conception of justice or the right way to treat human beings who are, as I suggested, equal moral agents. So you still have to you still have to show that it's within those bounds. But the economic consideration also is, well, is simply the question of compared to what? In other words, what other potential routes are there to achieve the good that we're talking about? We don't have to, we wouldn't have to consider every conceivable route, but among the actually available alternatives, are there other ways of achieving the good, assuming again that it's already consistent with morality, assuming that it's a good end? Are there other ways of achieving it than the one we're proposing? And my argument is that no single proposal can be, the case for any single proposal isn't yet made until you've shown that other potential routes of getting there are less preferable. They don't achieve it as efficiently, they're not consistent with morality, something like that. And that's a part of the argument that I find absent in a lot of the arguments for wealth redistribution. That there may be other ways of achieving this that could even be more consistent with this idea of equal moral agency, or more effective or more efficient, and they're often just left out of the discussion. And one sort of implied part of that or related part of that is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a big question. And what I mean by that is, well, what would those resources have done had we not reallocated them in this way? That's a hard question to answer, especially when you're dealing with large-scale policy or large-scale wealth redistribution. It's a hard question to answer, but referring back to the claim I made about a high justificatory burden, if we're dealing with human beings, and if we think human beings have certain kinds of rights, then I think we have to at least make a good faith attempt at answering that question. And we need to show, maybe not conclusively or mathematically or something, but we need to make a pretty good case, a reasonable case, a plausible case, that what we're proposing actually does create more benefit than any of these other alternatives, including the opportunity cost. So that's a little bit of sort of philosophical background and gives you an idea of the way I approach the question. So none of that is to say that wealth redistribution by the government cannot be justified. On the contrary, it just says this is what I think we would need to do or need to show in order to make the case. So I do think it's a high burden, and I mentioned in my opening chapter. So we have each of us has an opening chapter in the book. Then each of us has a response to one another's opening chapter, and then we have final concluding chapters where we, I guess, summarize our final reflections in response to the other's arguments. In my opening chapter, one of the things I suggest is that if we're going to evaluate government wealth redistribution, one of the first things we have to be clear about is, well, what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve? And that I think is a bit slipperier than it might initially seem. So, Steve suggested substantive equality of opportunity. That's certainly one plausible candidate, but there are others. And in fact, most people who argue for wealth redistribution, they have either other ideas or ideas that are only sort of orthogonal to that, or maybe tangential to that. So poverty, of course, this is the one Steve mentions, and that's one of the main targets of wealth redistribution. Punishing wrongdoing, which is perhaps what Steve is, that might be the category under which we might put something like racial injustice or colonialism. That's the second one, punishing wrongdoing. And the third one is a little bit broader, something like fairness or maybe equity, maybe equality understood in a certain kind of way, but then we do have to be pretty careful about how we defend equality or how we define equality. And I don't want to go on too long, but maybe I'll just say a word or two about each of those three. So first, with respect to poverty. So Steve and I agree, I think, that poverty is a problem, remains a problem. But one of the things that I think is often left out of the discussion is, so Steve mentions, it's been a problem, especially in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, and even in otherwise very wealthy places like the United States. All true. On the other hand, it's also the case that poverty is less of a problem now than it has ever been in human history. And I think that's something worth not just pointing out, but also perhaps investigating. So poverty is often talked about in two different ways, either absolute poverty or relative poverty. Absolute poverty is what the United Nations defines as living on about $2 contemporary dollars per person per day or less. And so, worldwide, we still have about, depending on estimates, something like 750 million or so people who are living at that level. That's the historical norm for almost all of human existence. Indeed, greater than 99.9% of the time that Homo sapiens has been on the planet. That's about the level of the standard level of human life. It's only in the last couple hundred years that we've finally figured out how we can enable more people to rise out of that level of poverty. And in the last 200 or so years, the total amount of wealth produced in the world has increased dramatically to unprecedented levels. And at the same time, what we have seen is that the proportion of people who are living at that level of absolute poverty has also declined dramatically. There is now, we're for the first time in human history, it looks like it's less than 10% of the total population that is living at that level. It's somewhere between, I suppose, 8 and 9%. And we just hit 8 billion people in population in the world. So if it's 750 million, it's just a little bit less than 10%. So that means we still have a lot of work to do, obviously, but it also means that there's a lot of good news there too. So people have been able to rise out of those historical norms of poverty really for the first time and in unprecedented numbers and unprecedented ways. So yes, poverty continues to be a problem, but especially absolute poverty is much less of a problem now than it has ever been in human history. So if we take a little bit longer of a historical perspective, I think there's much more cause for celebrating and the achievement we've been able to get. Not just focusing on the remaining parts, but there are still the remaining parts. The other aspect of that is relative poverty. That's something maybe we can talk about a little bit. I propose for the moment to leave that out of my opening remarks. Maybe Steve and I have slightly different. So relative poverty just means that some are poorer relative to other people or in comparison to other people. In the United States, and maybe we should focus on the United States, or we can focus on the United States. The proportion of people living in absolute poverty, especially if you take into consideration various kinds of charity and in-kind transfers among those that, including some of those that Steve mentioned, there are effectively 0 people in the United States who are still living in absolute poverty. Relative poverty is a different matter. I would like to say something about punishing wrongdoing. That I think is a little bit trickier. There's a little bit of nuance involved there because typically when we talk about punishing wrongdoing, what we have in mind is something like a compensatory conception of justice. In other words, there's some identifiable victimizer or victimizers who have done something wrong to some identifiable victim or victims. And standardly, there are lots of cases in which, obvious examples in which that could happen, murder, theft, including things like slavery. These all are infractions of this kind of compensatory conception of justice. And that conception of justice would very straightforwardly call for punishment or compensation, reparation. In other words, victimizers indemnifying the victims, their victims. What's much more difficult case to make is to address a case like racial injustice or the colonization of the United States and what happened in the United States to Native Americans on a distributive conception of justice. So one of the things that Steve defends in his portions of the book is a distributive conception of justice, which is something like, well, we want to look at the overall allocation of, say, wealth or prosperity in the world and ask ourselves, is this the proper or is this the right distribution? And in almost any case, if we do that, everybody's going to say no. I mean, we all have ideas about that there should be more resources here and fewer here, et cetera. But that conception of justice, it seems to me, and I would make the argument, can't be marshaled when we're talking about things like racial injustice or colonialism or reparations, because what that would do is, if we subscribe to a distributive conception of justice, it puts us in the rather unenviable position of saying, well, we can't just condemn those wrongs that were done to these groups of people in the past, or that are continuing to be done to these groups in the past. We can't just condemn them outright on grounds of justice. Instead, what we have to do is sort of take a look at the resulting distribution of resources and ask ourselves, well, is it better or worse? That, it seems to me, is the kind of consideration that's pretty close to a philosophical reductio ad absurdum, I think. If the conception of justice you're using leads to the conclusion that, well, we can't just condemn things like racial injustice outright, that instead we need to look at the overall distribution, then I think that's a problem for the conception of justice. And maybe I'll say one other thing about fairness. So fairness is a big issue. And that was the third one, the third potential target: fairness or equity or potentially inequality. There are different conceptions of fairness, of course. One that I use as sort of a provisional account is a kind of Rawlsian conception of fairness, by which I mean something like, what would we agree to behind a veil of ignorance? If we look at the distribution, and that's one way to understand, there are other ways to understand fairness, but if we think, a distribution is fair if it results from a distribution or a mechanism of distribution or a decision procedure that we would have agreed to behind a veil of ignorance. Then wealth redistribution, it's not clear that will be able to come out of that conception of, putting now Rawls's own argument to one side. It's not clear to me that it would come out of that conception of fairness from behind a veil of ignorance. And one reason for that, I have a few reasons, but I'll mention just one. One reason for that is that it's not clear that we would ever enter into the kinds of partnerships that we would like to have people enter into, the kinds of mutually beneficial, productive partnerships that we want to think that really are what the rules of justice ought to enable people to engage in society. If from behind the veil of ignorance, we didn't know whether the distribution was going to match either our inputs or our outputs, or even after the input and output, you could have a subsequent redistribution afterwards based on some other principle of consideration that's not whatever we agreed to behind the veil of ignorance. So if the definition of fairness we're using is this Rawlsian one, where what we would agree to behind the veil of ignorance, then I think endorsing an after the fact, so an ex post facto possibility of redistribution of wealth might jeopardize the kinds of partnerships and arrangements, and then even the agreement to the principles in the first place from behind the veil of ignorance. And then maybe I'll conclude, if I may, with just one other thing. I talked a little bit in my response to Steve about what I called somewhat cheekily David Hume's knave principle. So Hume's, the great 18th century philosopher who claimed that it was a just political maxim to assume that everybody in politics is a knave. And even though it's not the case that everybody in politics is a knave, he thinks this is an important maxim to keep in mind. And the reason for that, he said, I think this is an early sort of public choice, at least this is my claim, it's a kind of early public choice insight, which is that there's a long distance between the principles we would endorse as theorists and their effectuation in policy and practice. And there's a lot of reason to think that whatever ends up happening in practice won't approximate anything like what we would have liked to have had when we're endorsing things in theory. And I think there, and maybe this gets a little bit to the evidence that we might talk about, there I think there's quite a bit of evidence that the kinds of policies that we end up actually getting, especially in government, even if they're well-intentioned by the theorists, become distorted through in all sorts of ways, and can lead to all sorts of not just disincentives or misalignment of disincentives, but even a counterproductive incentives and counterproductive results. So the idea, this is perhaps reflected. One example that might reflect this is the Medicare and Medicaid that Steve mentioned. So these have grown enormously since they were first, both in real terms, I mean, both in nominal terms and in real terms and in proportion of the gross domestic product, far outstripping anything, even the growth of the population. They've grown enormously, way beyond what their initial proponents suggested. That's one small piece of what has led to what we now have, something like a $31 trillion national debt, which is about $94,000 for every man, woman, and child, every single person in the United States. And that's not even our total debt. Our total debt is more, especially if you, and I don't want to get into the weeds, especially with an economist about this, but if you consider the net present value, in other words, how much money do we need to have now in order to make good on the current promises that we already have with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security added to the national debt? Well, then you get these sort of monopoly numbers of $100 trillion. I've seen estimates of $200 trillion. That would be more than the total assets that the United States has. So that's a lot of money, way more money than, I mean, it's hard to even imagine those sorts of numbers, but it's way more money than any of those individual programs were initially predicted or estimated to cost. And that raises maybe my final question, which is, the programs that Steve is suggesting we perhaps increase or we perhaps target or focus on, things like food stamps or SNAP, health insurance, preschool programs, opportunity accounts. We can talk about that. Any or all of them might be good ideas in themselves, but all of those are already. So if we add up the total cost of all of those, they're a tiny proportion of the money the federal government, United States federal government, has already spent combating exactly those aims. So if we've spent something like, and I think this is the current estimate, about $30 trillion since the onset of the war on poverty, $30 trillion, that's a lot of money. It's orders of magnitude more money than what Steve is proposing we spend in addition. And so that raises the question in my mind, and I would, maybe we can talk about this. Why hasn't it already worked? So that seems to me to suggest that, well, maybe the question of is it predictably effective is perhaps more salient than we're giving it credit for.
Okay. So to sum up your case, you sort of agree with Steve about substantive equality of opportunity as an ideal, but you have, maybe there are like certain ways in which the bar for the sort of argument that he wants to make is quite high and difficult to meet, you think, because when we're talking about government redistribution, there's this presumption against interfering with individuals' agency by taking their money and giving it to something else that they don't want it to be given to. Because what you're going to do to promote equality of opportunity needs to be something that you can like see in advance is reasonably likely to work or something like that. And you're not sure about that because we need to consider, are there other ways through, free market methods or private charity or whatever of meeting these aims? And because particularly we need to think about maybe from a public choice theory perspective or something, government agents often have maybe corrupt incentives or are not very competent, or things kind of grow out of hand over time or something. And so probably what they implement is not going to be the ideal proposal that an economist would design anyway. And so these things all kind of make it difficult to justify expanding government programs. And then you also have some worries about maybe other potential methods of trying to justify these programs, but that's sort of the part maybe that is most directly relevant to Steve's case. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And I would, though, add that you don't have to assume, I don't think one has to assume, maybe there are some people who do so, but I don't think you have to assume that government agents are corrupt or that they're immoral or something.
Right.
I mean, I think it's sufficient or incompetent. I mean, maybe that some of that is true, but you don't have to assume that. I think you can just assume that they often have their own ends, which may or may not be the same ends or goals or preferences that theorists or that we might or philosophers or economists that we might ideally like them to have.
Right. So maybe, yeah, maybe now we should shift into discussion. Really, we can talk about if there's any burning issues that either of you have that you want to immediately bring up, we can do that. Maybe as kind of a general structure, it might make sense to talk about kind of the more philosophical side, this principle of equal moral agency and whether that creates a strong presumption against redistribution. And then also talk about the more, like, having dealt with that, talk about the more empirical side about do we really have good evidence that these programs work? Could this be done in some other way? Something like that. Yeah, unless anyone has any objections, maybe the first question is something like, Steve, what do you think about this principle of equal moral agency, and does it create a presumption against government redistribution?
I mean, one of the neat things that comes out in this book, of course, is that Jim pushes me to think hard in directions that I hadn't when I was writing my initial statement. And this is one that I had to dwell on a bit. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll let me offer. This is totally new content for our viewers. It does not appear in the book. What if I offer at this point let me try to make an argument for redistribution that I think maybe does meet Jim's higher bar, and let's see if, or at least I'm very curious to how he'd respond, and maybe this will help us tease it out. I mean, on balance, I tend to agree with just about everything Jim writes. I mean, we have some like pointed disagreements about matters of fact here and there that come out, but it's often a disagreement about priorities or about degree. So how big is the problem that he points out with this, or how big is the problem that I point out, and we have different ways of weighing them. Now, with this, of course, I couldn't believe that, that free exchange and private property are good without also, to a certain degree, agreeing with Jim's principle, right? We don't arbitrarily appropriate people's property without really good reason. And that's a foundational principle for a free society, and one which I heartily endorse. Now, let me throw a new proposal in here, though. One of the ways that I talk about in the chapter a bit about the ways that economists think about wealth redistribution is to think in terms of safety net programs. And I often think I think this throws a little bit of a difficulty into this particular framework, because if we assume that if we say we want to respect people's decisions because they're equal moral agents, which sounds great, that doesn't take into account what I see as one of the major things that the welfare state is trying to do, which is to deal with unforeseen tragedy. Just the fact that in real life, we haven't yet found a way to create a market economy that doesn't have recessions periodically and crises that throw lots of people out of work, often for no fault of their own. And so uncertainty and really significant risk is just a basic fact of life in economic life, but also, since we're talking about healthcare, right? Risk, really, really substantial financial risk, is just a basic fact of living in a world with modern medicine. And it strikes me that having some kind of system to deal with that risk is important. And we have good evidence that risk of unemployment, for example, there isn't a good non-government way of dealing with that risk, in that I can't go out and I can't buy unemployment insurance on the private market. All I can do is save money, but it might take a decade for me to save up enough wealth to really insure against the risk of unemployment. And of course, unemployment can hit folks that are more marginally connected to the labor market a little more heavily. So I wonder if there'd be a place in Jim's framework, maybe this would pass the justificatory burden, to have something like unemployment insurance or catastrophic health insurance, as still respecting the moral agency of individuals because of this fact of the world. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, great question. So if I may, Dustin, just respond to that. So yeah. I would say that if we're going to make it, if one were to make the case you're arguing for, that's exactly the kind of targeted area. So thinking about things that are maybe not just unforeseeable, but both unforeseeable and dramatic. So not marginally, not marginal issues, but dramatic issues. The company goes out of business, or they leave town, or whatever. Something fairly dramatic. A catastrophic health issue that you're talking about. Those are exactly the kinds of things that I think are really the hard cases and the tough cases. What I might suggest, could those pass or meet the justificatory burden that I'm talking about? I would say potentially, but I'm not going to commit fully quite yet, because I have a couple of other questions I think would have to be asked. I don't want to put you on the spot about these, although I'm happy to hear your thoughts. But I don't think the case would yet be closed. One of them is because there is such a thing as private insurance. There's private insurance against all of those things. Now, is there as much private insurance, or is it as inexpensive as we might like it to be? I think probably not. I mean, you're the expert on that. So my guess is that the answer is probably not. But I think we need to take a bit of a broader perspective. So, Steve, I would say we need to ask the question of, well, why isn't there? Why isn't there more, less expensive health insurance or catastrophic health insurance? Why isn't there more private insurance? And one of the reasons is because it's crowded out by these other programs that already exist that the government provides. So there's just such a tiny market. And in some cases, some kinds of insurance are actually outlawed. You cannot, no private entity is even allowed to do it. So it's hard to make the case, I think, that, well, there wouldn't be the right kind of insurance in, I don't know, this world, this Adam Smithian world, or whatever it is that I'm talking about. Because we don't really have the good test case, or it's not as obvious anyway to me that we would have the test case. But I also think, and this is maybe a slight extension of the question you're asking. When there is when people have these kinds of tragedies, including unforeseeable or unforeseen tragedies that we're talking about, the question of what the best thing to do to help people is often difficult to assess from afar. In other words, you don't always know from afar what the best way to help somebody is, even granting that something bad has happened and they need some help. And in those cases, what often is required is something like a bit of localized knowledge. So you need to know something about the person or the people involved, the situation involved, maybe some of the history that's going on. And you might also need to know something about their personalities and the relations they have to other members of the family in order to know whether the kind of help you're considering giving would actually be helpful or not. There is unfortunately this phenomenon of think of charitable help, for example, or voluntary aid. Sometimes it doesn't actually help. It doesn't do the thing it was supposed to do, and there are some tragic cases where it actually is counterproductive. It makes things worse off. So that can happen too. So how do you actually know what the best thing to do is? And I think, and I would argue that that's actually harder than you might think, or than it might seem. It's harder to know what would actually constitute genuine help for somebody than it might initially seem. Sometimes money is the right answer. Sometimes it's entirely different things, and money might actually make the situation worse. So in those cases, what I think is, and this is sort of what I argue at the end of my section, that the kinds of cases that you're thinking about, which concern me as well, oftentimes, maybe not always. In fact, I would say probably not always, but at least in many cases, it is true, I think, that these are calls for what I think of as solidarity. In other words, for private action, including collective private action, where people actually make an attempt to get to know the person and the situation more intimately so that they can try to have a better chance of figuring out how to help in such a way that what they want to do would actually constitute help. That's much harder to do. And in fact, I would say it's almost impossible to do from a centralized location from Washington, D.C. So people in Washington, D.C. aren't going to have any idea what kind of help you or I need in these sorts of situations. But there are thousands of charities, in fact, tens of thousands, maybe even in the millions of charities in the United States. I mean, Americans are extraordinarily generous. They give hundreds of billions of dollars to various kinds of charitable efforts every year. Would these solve all of those problems? I don't think so, but I don't think perfection is the standard, or at least is an acceptable standard, because we live in a fallen world with imperfect creatures. There is no system that's perfect. So I think that means that we're sort of reduced to, or resigned to, thinking about, well, what's the next best? What's the best of the alternatives, or the better, the relatively better of the alternatives, maybe even in some cases, what's the least bad. And there, I think the case is not quite so clear. And so there may well be cases in which, the only real way to do something is through some kind of collective, maybe a local government action, maybe a state government action, maybe even some cases a federal government action. But I would say solidarity, and then as suggested by me, talking about local, state, and federal action, also a principle of subsidiarity, which I think is important for the localized knowledge. The closer a person or group or organization is to the people who need help, the more likely they are to know what would actually constitute help. So I would say that doesn't mean you cannot have federal government action along the lines that you're suggesting, but I would say that's probably, I would argue, that should be a last resort. We should first look to other things that might be able to exploit that localized knowledge better.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, my thought about that response, for one thing, I guess I'm pretty skeptical about whether private charity would actually like be on the scale needed to like make up the deficit if you cut. I don't think, I mean, it would have to, like, the amount of charitable giving towards poverty relief would have to increase by so much, and in ways that it doesn't seem to me like it it doesn't seem to me that it was at that level before we implemented these programs, or that it increases in an offsetting way when they're cut. That
well, what's the standard, or what's the comparison class? Is it, would private charity equal federal spending? I'm sure the answer to that is no.
Yeah, would it be able to meet the same need or something like, I mean, do as much good?
I mean, it's hard to say, and we have to look at a lot of indirect evidence. One thing I don't think I cite, although maybe Steve could correct me if I'm wrong, but one person whose work I would cite in this regard, just for your readers or the readers of the book, or maybe for the audience, is David Beito, Beito. So he's a historian who's looked at private charitable initiatives, including fraternal societies, especially in the late 19th century and turning into the 20th century. What he's found now, how that relates to 2022 is a different question. But what he found in the United States, it used to be the case that there were these very extensive fraternal societies. So there's still a little bit that left. The Elks clubs and these kinds of things still exist to some extent. But these were actually fairly robust entities in communities, especially the poorer communities. So the poorer a community was, the more likely it was that there were these kinds of fraternal societies. In the late 19th into early 20th century, they began to die out effectively with the New Deal. And maybe that's not just a coincidence, but they began to die out around the New Deal. But anyway, I bring it up because, what did these fraternal societies do? Well, they provided an entire range, privately funded through the members of the society, of services that might surprise us today, certainly surprised me. So things like life insurance, health insurance, they built hospitals, they built schools, they provided unemployment insurance, they provided employment training and skills training. So quite an array of things that were targeted to their community's needs in a way that was much more sensitive, I would suggest, to what was actually important and needed in those communities, including things, by the way, that that are controversial, like abortion services, for example. So one of the things that he talks about is that especially in Black American, African American communities in the poorer South, Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta areas, for example, they couldn't get good health care. So there were doctors that were completely private doctors who were paid for by these fraternal societies and to provide health care for people who, just for all sorts of unjust reasons, and other reasons, were not able to get it otherwise. So, would that be enough? Might depend on what the definition of enough is. But I would suggest, and I do a little bit of this in the book, I give some citations to some people who've investigated this a little bit empirically, and who suggest that there might be more. I'll leave it just this way. There might be more than we might initially suspect.
Yeah, I guess it's nonetheless the case that, say, like, elderly poverty went way down after Social Security was implemented and so forth. So I guess
It was already going down before Social Security, and it went down less fast after Social Security.
Yeah.
So yes, it did go down, but not at the same rate. And it was already going down at a faster rate before that.
So
Yeah.
let me jump in here and note that that in some sense, the case that Jim is trying to make, I recognize it's difficult by its very nature to come up with a public like an easy policy evaluation study that shows that it would work. It's easy to evaluate a program like food stamps that's implemented in a particular place and time. It's harder to evaluate what would have occurred in a place over time as it became more wealthy if food stamps hadn't existed, right? And that does make it a little bit easier for me to say this alternative works, and find some empirical evidence of it than it is. But that, of course, doesn't mean that we know with certainty one way or the other what would happen in its absence. There is good evidence that public policy programs did crowd out private charitable contributions of the same kind of goods, and we do have that. At the same time, I think we do also have really good evidence that programs like food stamps and Medicaid, when they went into effect and had a significant impact where they went into effect, over and above the places where they didn't. And I at least take that as decent evidence that whatever else would have happened or whatever else was going on in that time and place was, even if there was some crowd out, it was less than what we would want. But that doesn't tell us where the standard is that we want to aim for. And one of the things I think that that comes out in this conversation, whenever it's had, but it certainly comes out in the debate that Jim and I have, is the line that's really difficult for me to draw in a clear philosophical way, which is what level of well-being is actually required to provide the level of opportunity that I want. There's always one more benefit that I could make a case would have a good impact, but I can't tell you when we've met the line and the government has done its job. Now, weighing the evidence overall, I think I show good evidence that there's really significant benefits that are really hindering people in participating in ways that I think are important. But it's hard to draw a bright line on that, and that makes it really easy for conversations like this to just dance around where the standard is, which of course we do, and I think we do brilliantly, but that is sometimes where we end up.
I would say, could I ask a slightly different question? So I take that point, and I mean I think that's a generous point to make, and I think it's a good one to make, because it's hard to make these sorts of predictions about what would have happened, and I appreciate you saying, well, would the next benefit be the one that would get us to the right level? One thing that could potentially help with that, and I do talk a little bit about this in some of my sections, but not extensively. What can help, I think, with that is looking at comparing different countries and their policies. So we do have pretty good data about lots of different experiments that have been run in different countries over time, and that does give us a little bit of an ability to see, well, under which systems of political economy, using that term very very generously, in which systems of them do the poor fare but tend to fare better, as opposed to in which systems do they tend to fare worse. So there, I think we can make a little bit of indirect. That's a little bit of evidence. It's not decisive, I think. It's hard to put human beings into controlled experiments. I mean, I guess that's what you would like to do.
Yes, it is.
Yes, but I would like to, if we could for a second, maybe return to this question of justice. So we've talked a little bit about it. I talked about it, and we kind of come back to it. One of the things, so Steve, I would like to put you on the spot a little bit, but not in any sort of malicious way. I'm just genuinely interested to hear your thoughts about this. So you give your argument about economic justice, and to meet demands. I'm just reading what you said. Demands of economic justice, we have to work to build a legal and economic structure that grants each person the opportunity to participate and contribute to economic life. In the United States, some of that is limited by poverty and other things, including history of economic oppression. And there are at least some. These are how you put it. Redistributive government programs that, if expanded, would increase the opportunity for people to participate in economic life, and so therefore the United States should do that. We should pursue those policies that would do that. One of the things that I suggest in my response to that is that there are other things we might substitute for economic justice and otherwise maintain the argument. But the conclusion then, I think, probably nobody would want to to endorse. For example, suppose there were evidence, replace economics with religion. There are people who are not able to participate in religious life, let's say. And maybe there are various reasons for that. Maybe there's evidence that being religious or participating in the activities of a religion actually has beneficial effects on people's lives, and there's some evidence for that. Would the same conclusion follow? Well, therefore, the United States government should, subsidize somehow religion, or maybe it should expand redistribution in favor of religion, give everybody, I don't know, a tax break if you go to church every Sunday or something, or whatever it would be, or maybe tax everybody at a low rate, 1%, and redistribute that to churches or something, or maybe to specific churches. And I think you might make a similar sort of, change your argument a little bit with respect to marriage. There's also quite a bit of empirical evidence that being married has all sorts of beneficial effects on people. We could run the same sort of argument. Would we conclude that therefore the government should, I don't know what it would be, give people money, give you a $10,000 voucher if you get married or something, or maybe more the longer you're married. I don't know what it would be. My guess is that the answer would be no. We wouldn't want the government, involving itself in that sort of way in religious matters or in, people's marriages. But that seems to be something that your argument, as stated, is open to. It's potentially open to various other kinds of things, not just economic opportunity, which also can have, and there's some evidence for it, can have quite an effect on people's lives. So how would you say we can target the economic opportunity while not allowing these other kinds of things that we might, for other reasons, not want the government to get involved in?
Well, first I'll bite the bullet and say that the kind of things that I want the government involved in is pretty broad, right? Let's lay it out there. I want the government to provide people with money to buy food. I want the government to provide schooling for pre-K kids. I want the government to pay for healthcare. So I don't say that the government should subsidize marriages or church services. And that's for multiple reasons. One would be a kind of prudential judgment that government funding of either marriages or church services would not actually do any good. And I'd be somewhat skeptical of the evidence until you showed me really good evidence that the government promotion of church services actually has the impact that you would claim it does. Even if religion has the impact, then we'd want to know that the government funding of religion has the kind of impact that we'd be looking for. And there, my guess is that the evidence is not very strong, certainly not nearly as strong as the evidence that I try to garner in favor of the welfare state. But there is also a difference in kind here, both for marriage and for religion. The kinds of things that the government would be funding would be different in kind than the kinds of things that I would be asking the government to fund. I'm basically asking the government to provide goods, services, and resources, which is fundamentally different than the kind of relationships that constitute the good of either religion or family. And I think that's important. And here I feel like I'm delving sort of deeply into the kind of philosophy that I'm way over my head in terms of, talking about the nature of these things and what makes them different and why one would be justified for government action and one not. Suffice it to say, I'm working with a vision of justice in my head, at least, that says that part of the government's job is to create an economic order in which people have the opportunity to participate in these particular ways. And that does cordon off the areas of life where I think the government has a real job to do. It's still pretty broad, but I think there's a difference in kind. So that is to say, I don't necessarily accept your thought experiment.
But I
And
guess
I
the
think it's an
question
awkward thought
becomes,
experiment for a reason. Yeah.
yeah, I guess the question becomes, why is it a relevant difference in kind? You know, if you could also
Yeah.
promote public health by getting people to go to church more because religion has various benefits, then what is the
Yeah. I mean, I'd say weighing against it is a whole lot of evidence that government subsidization of religion has a whole bunch of other problematic effects, and we could have a whole debate about that. I accept the separation of church and state in the United States, and our traditions and our sort of rules of thumb about that is as generally wise. I don't think I can give a knockdown, drag out answer for what the relevant differences are, but I would baseline, I would guess that they're there, and I'd guess that you agree with me, Jim, but that that you think they might also apply to the welfare state, where I do
Right.
not.
I mean, so that's the question. So yes, I don't think the government should be involving itself in marriage or in religion. But it sounds to me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me that your argument it's really about, you know, what's the structure or motivation of your argument. And it sounds to me that your argument is really not a kind of principled one, that there are some things that the government shouldn't do because I don't know if you remember the first line of Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia says people have rights, and there are some things that you shouldn't do to people without violating their rights. Period. You know, that's it. That's sort of the starting premise. So it sounds to me that that's not your argument. It sounds to me that in order for your argument about economic opportunity, now just sticking with your argument of economic opportunity, it sounds to me more like it really is a kind of broadly based utilitarian argument. What are the things that that would actually lead to a benefit? And I, Steve, think that this is one area where government action could lead to benefit. My worry about that, and those other examples are meant to illustrate that worry, is that that's a much broader argument than just economic opportunity. That if the way you're arguing is that, well, let's empirically, maybe it's just an empirical matter. Does subsidizing religion help or not? Okay, that's an empirical matter. Maybe we should have experiments in that, let different states do different things or different localities do different things, or marriage or something we can let, and then we'll evaluate it empirically afterwards. That's a very different sort of argument, or it could lead to all kinds of conclusions, I think, that I would want to reject on principle and say that at least some of those shouldn't be subject to empirical analysis. Going back to my equal moral agency principle, there are some things that even if it led to a net benefit, understood in some way, some kind of a net utilitarian increase, there are some things you may not do to people or should not do to people regardless. It does seem to me to be, maybe that's a slightly different way of approaching this conception of justice that underlies your argument.
So I think I can respond a little bit better then. So first off, it's worth noting that I am an economist, and economists have a kind of language and a way of making arguments that is heavily influenced by utilitarianism. So when I talk about making a case for anything, it's really easy for me to slip into utilitarian language. And sometimes that's intentional and that fits. And sometimes maybe it's the kind of arguments we make. And it's worth sort of getting pushed on this because I'm not sure I was intending to make a strictly consequentialist argument there. I think I would I would put it this way, though. I think the case I'm making is that a good society is one in which these goods exist and are provided, but I'm not committed to the government providing them. And this is something that we kind of tease out in the book. Is I'm not actually committed to these programs being required by justice or the government providing them. I am committed to finding a way to provide these goods. And I think a good society is one in which people do have the ability to participate in these economic institutions in important ways, which means that I have to, on principle, be open to the idea that they might be better provided by an institution that isn't the government. And I have to be curious about the arguments you make about non-government institutions providing these things better. That said, my reading of the evidence, and I try to present the evidence, is that on balance, the society that we have in its current organization would not provide these goods, does not provide these goods without government intervention. And so government intervention is the best answer we have for a society that will meet these particular standards. What I do not consider carefully in the case is, and I think you're pushing me on here, is any kind of really deep thinking about what the government's job is on principle, because I accept already as a state of affairs that this is an arena in which the government is involved, and I think the government could be involved better. Implicitly, I am buying into the idea that the government should be involved in these kinds of things, and I accept that. I think I'd probably bite that bullet happily, and that there's probably good reasons why the government isn't involved in these other ones, but I'm not prepared to make the philosophical case for it. Yeah. So I will not let you back me into a strict theory of government, except that I admit that one exists in the background.
Yeah. So maybe, I mean, what's plausible about Jim's position here is this thought that the reason for the government not to be involved in religion is some principled thing having to do with liberal values that, you know, even if somehow you could do it in a way that would produce good effects on balance, you know, that's not really the main reason. And so then the question becomes, like, if liberal values or the equal moral agency principle or something, if those provide this like really strong presumption against involvement in religion, even if it would produce social benefits of various forms, what is there like some relevant difference with involvement in redistribution, such that, you know, one is a violation of liberal values, but the other one you can just crunch the numbers and see what will promote. I guess maybe, I mean, my own inclination is to be quite doubtful about whether redistribution is condemned by the equal moral agency principle. So maybe the thought here is something like, it seems to me almost like you have to sort of privilege the distribution produced by the market, and think that's the thing where changing that violates equal moral agency in a way that, say, enforcing market outcomes doesn't. And that's not clear to me. I mean, the way I think about it, my co-advisor was Paul Weidman, who was a student of Rawls. So yeah, that's all sort of washed off onto me. But you know, the way I'm kind of thinking of it is something like, look, we need to set up an economic system that fulfills certain goals having to do with fairness or with equality of opportunity or with general prosperity or whatever. And you know, that same system is the thing, that's the thing that is like assigning property rights. And part of what's built into that assigning is that we maybe can take some of it for some good purpose and blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, the system says, if you're a factory owner, then, okay, you have the right to exclude other people from, you know, your workers can't come in and use your factory to make something on their own, right, in their free time. And if they did, like, you would own that, right? Prima facie, that might look like a violation of their agency. Like, you're saying that here's this thing, nobody's using it right now, they can't come in. You know, maybe they even offer to pay for maintenance if they break anything or whatever. And then, you know, that's so like, there's that. Then you make some money and then we take some of it. Oh, that might also look like a violation of equal moral agency. I kind of want to say neither. I mean, assuming that like both capitalism and the redistributive state are justified in terms of these other aims, I want to say neither of those is a violation of equal moral agency, because like what you have a right to is just part of this general system that includes both the right to own capital and the right of the government to tax you, to redistribute, so that when there are market failures and so forth, we can help people. And that's to my mind, that's sort of why there's kind of an in principle problem with, say, the government involvement in religion and not with government involvement in the economy, or at least that's maybe one plausible candidate for why there might be an in principle problem in one case and not the other.
Could I just jump in? Jim does deserve the right to talk next, but I just want to note that I think that's very similar to an argument I make at the end of my second essay for people who are just itching to get into the book. And you can go see if my version is as eloquent as Dustin's, you know, by comparing these carefully. But over to you, Jim.
Well, and you can check the final part of my contribution where I decisively refute both of them. So I would say, I mean, just, quickly, that, so Dustin, you and I may have a different idea about what actually is implied by a commitment to equal moral agency, and what that says about the proper scope or function of government. That may be true. But one thing you said at the beginning of your remarks that I do want to dispute, and that is that my alternative is let the market handle it. That's not what I'm suggesting. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting, and I don't defend anywhere in there capitalism, whatever that might be. I think there are many other routes to meeting human needs and to generating and encouraging and upholding a just and humane society, other than just letting. I mean, markets are good at many things, but they're certainly not good at everything. And let there be no misunderstanding that I'm suggesting markets can just take care of everything or something, or that the prima facie liberal position, or maybe classical liberal position, is that whatever the market says or does is therefore right or something. Nothing like that. I think there are many routes to generating benefit for human beings. Steve tends to focus on the federal government's role. My suggestion is that, well, there are a lot of other things too, and that if we're going to talk about what kinds of federal policies we want, we should really look at what other options are available too. I mean, in addition to federal government, there's also state government, there's also local government, there's also, as we've talked a little bit about, private charity. I mean, and these are not either ors; these are all in addition tos. And there's also quite a bit of interest, and this is something we haven't really talked about, among private actors, even for profit, for creating benefit for underprivileged communities. One example I mentioned in the book is Walmart, which is one of the largest companies in the world and has become that by trying to serve the poorer segments of society rather than wealthier segments. So would any one of those satisfy all of the desires or all the needs that we have? Probably not. Would some combination possibly, maybe different combinations in different places potentially? So that I think goes back to really the very first thing that I said, which was, the case I make in the book is not that that wealth should not be redistributed. It's just that the case for doing it at the federal level is often, I think, under substantiated, because it often doesn't look at all of these other alternatives and consider the benefits and liabilities of them as well.
Yeah. I take the point. It's not like you just want the market distribution and then we don't need to do anything else, because you recognize the need for private charity and that sort of stuff. I guess I was thinking, for the argument, for the equal moral agency argument to work, you do have to think that there's something privileged about the market distribution, in the sense that the market has distributed it, and now that's where this presumption kicks in that, okay, now the money is yours and taking it from you is a violation of your agency, and so it's up to you to give it to charity, in a way that it doesn't kick in when we have.
I would still push back on calling that the market, because by referring to equal moral agency, what I'm thinking about is human action, which can include voluntary action, charitable action, localized government action. So these are all parts of human action. So I think those are what are privileged. The market is part of that, or can be part of that, but it's certainly not the entire thing. I don't think the market itself has any special privilege that's greater than these other kinds of things, even including, as I talked about at the very end, the sort of logic of gift giving. That's an important part of human action, and I think it's an important part of generating just and humane societies and communities that we would like to live in. So I think that is just as much privileged for equal human agency, as I suggest, as other kinds of action are too.
Oh, sure. I'm just thinking, you don't think it's a violation, or I assume, like, if the worker wants to go in at nighttime and use the factory and a policeman comes and arrests him, you don't think that that's a violation of equal moral agency, right? That's not a violation of the worker's equal moral agency.
Oh, I see. To use somebody else's property without their permission or whatever.
Whereas you do think that it's a violation of the owner's equal moral agency to tax, or at least it's prima facie an infringement of it or something.
Prima facie, I would say yes.
Yeah, and so it looks like there has to be something kind of normatively privileged about libertarian property rights, such that acting against those is a violation of equal moral agency, whereas enforcing them is not.
Yeah, I think I would probably call myself sort of a Humean on property there, but yeah, I do think that's the default. But it's a robust default, but it's just a default. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Are there other issues people are dying to discuss? A lot of things have come up here, so there are a lot of directions we should be wrapping up soon, but there are a lot of final directions we could go in.
Maybe one thing that I would mention, and I mentioned, maybe this could be the final sort of thing I would mention. I hope there's a lot more in the discussion that we had, and I'm very actually pleased about this discussion, because among the points of potential disagreement, what also emerged were other points of agreement. We have similar kinds of concerns. I think, from my perspective, the main question is about what are the best ways to try to address these concerns. And there are moral considerations, there are empirical considerations, and so those are sometimes contested. But the goals, I think, are I believe it. I don't want to speak for you, Steve, but I think we share the goals of enabling people to lead lives of flourishing lives of meaning and purpose. That's really the goal. One thing I would mention, though, and I mentioned this at the end, is that I think a kind of, maybe it's a rhetorical rather than philosophically powerful way to talk about redistribution, or the care that we're called on in various ways, either morally or maybe religiously, depending on one's perspective, to give for people who are in need or people who are poor. I think perhaps a different way of framing that call is to say, is to acknowledge that sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrifice. Oftentimes the argument is couched in terms of, well, we'll all somehow be better off, kind of by an Adam Smithian invisible hand or something, that, well, if we enable the poor, if we expand equality of opportunity for the poor, then it'll increase GDP, and we'll have they'll enter the workforce and be productive citizens rather than something else. I mean, that might all be true, but I find those, and I would just offer this for your consideration, your viewers' consideration. I find those somewhat less motivating than if you say, sometimes you just need to make a sacrifice for somebody else, and that's okay, and that acting virtuously or doing the right thing sometimes just requires sacrifice. If it turns out to benefit you down the road or indirectly or somehow, great, but that's not why you do it. You do it because it's the right thing. And I think that's a way of approaching poverty and the needs of the least among us that really can be rhetorically powerful. And I think it's consistent. It's at least consistent with the conception of justice and the overall argument that I made. But I think that can actually be a very powerful way of motivating the right kinds of activities on the part of individuals, not just asking public officials to do something for us, but actually motivating individuals to meet the proper demands of morality in their own lives.
And let me maybe offer two observations. One, in response to what Jim has just said, which I resonate with. I think we might disagree on one element, and that is that I think one of the ways we can behave virtuously is to craft public policy that explicitly calls all of us to contribute to a good of someone who's in poverty, and it doesn't have to be just an individual choice, but those are collective choices that we can make as a public at a city level, a state level, and a national level. And there's I know there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not we can consider government action to fit into the same kind of category. But I think that's one of the ways we do good, is to help craft a system that does provide a good place to live for those around us, even if it doesn't benefit us, right? Even if it involves higher taxes or something. I think one thing that I would note in kind of just to set the stage at the very end for maybe one of the other places where we might disagree in kind of big picture terms, that I think motivates a lot in the background of my own thinking about this, is the question of what kind of economy do we live in? And what kind of economy are we moving into for the next 50 to 100 years? And my sense is that one of the quirks of the world we're living in, that we're heading into, is that it takes a lot more investment, a lot more material investment to get someone participating fully in public life today than it did 100 years ago. that doesn't just mean the cost of education is higher, although it is. It also means that the level of education that people need to really flourish is higher than it used to be. And that's just a fact of specialization. But also there's a kind of volatility in the world that has actually been here for a long time, but I think there's very real risks people face. And so part of my thinking about redistribution really is thinking about what kind of economy do we want to craft to face these kind of big challenges, even among wealthy countries where we're facing kind of significant risks. How do we deal with those on a systemic level? That doesn't translate nicely into these questions of individual character or of justice necessarily, but it's really closely related. And as an economist, that's my dominant way of thinking, is what kind of system do we need to meet the needs that people are going to face over the next 100 years? And this is my best attempt to try to describe it. I wonder, Jim, if you do see a disagreement there, do you see the needs of the economy or the challenges we face as sort of broadly differently than that, or do you agree that those are the challenges and you would just address them differently?
That should be the subject of our next podcast. Maybe we can talk more about that, more generally, what system of economics we should have, and why we should have the one we should have.
That's fair.
But I would say, in broad strokes, I agree. So the question about what kinds of things would we like an economy to produce, create, provide, and should it be ordered or organized or oriented towards the goals that we think are the right moral goals? Maybe I would say, in my words, contributing to not just a just and humane society, but to a life of a flourishing life of meaning and purpose. Yes, absolutely. So we may have different ideas about exactly what system of economics or what kinds of policies might contribute to that. But yes, no, I think that's that is what we would want, or that's what I think. I think we probably agree about that. I would say one aspect of that, maybe the last things I'll say. One, I think it's much harder to know what those will be than maybe you're inclined to say. I think our knowledge is quite a bit more limited about those sorts of things, which is why I tend to revert to, well, before you do something that might hurt, don't do anything at all. That tends to be my default. So I think our knowledge is limited about that. But the other thing I think that maybe you and I probably also would agree about, although we haven't talked much about it, and that is that the antidote to poverty is prosperity. So the way we're able to help people is by having the resources to do so. That's not just money. That's goods, services. I mean, also money, but goods, services, time, talent, and treasure. All of those things matter. So one of the goals, I think, of an economy, a humane economy, is to enable the increasing production of resources that enables us to address more and more of people's needs. And production is a big part of the question, I think, for economists, but also sort of political economists, that often isn't quite addressed or isn't squarely addressed in questions about redistribution. You need resources first before you can redistribute them. And so I think that means that we also need to think, in addition to what's the right way to redistribute, we also need to think about what's the right way to encourage increasing production of prosperity.
It's probably a good place to end, because I do actually agree with everything Jim just said.
Yeah.
What do you know?
Yeah. And I guess on the individual level, I have my effective altruism shirt on. So if anyone watching wants to,
is that what that is? Okay.
Yeah, wants to give some money
to
help some of the poorest.
Me, Dustin? I have a portrait of David Hume there on the wall up there.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, so if anyone watching wants to give some money this holiday season to help some of the poorest people in the world, I'll put a link to GiveWell in the description. So yeah, thank you both for your time. I think this was a good conversation. And I'll see the folks on YouTube a bit later.